Thank you, Madam President. I rise to speak to the independent review into Commonwealth parliamentary workplaces. I thought I would start with a statement from one of the staffers who spoke to the inquiry, and I quote, "This is Parliament. It should set the standard for workplace culture, not the floor of what culture should be," end quote. Who could possibly argue with that? But as we've seen over the past few years, the standard of workplace culture in this place is not that flash. We have heard a lot of hair-raising stories about the culture of bullying and sexual harassment in this place. I'm not going to speak about this because I can see that plenty of you have. What I do want to talk about is what the report says about, and I quote, long and irregular hours of work. End quote. Not something that will be touched by the government's industrial relations reforms, mind you, because none of those reforms apply to the people who work in Parliament. When this government was elected, one of their first acts was to take 2 advisors from every lower house and Senate crossbench. At the time, the Prime Minister said that crossbench MPs shouldn't have twice the staff of government and opposition MPs. He also said that assistant ministers only get 2 additional staff, according to the Prime Minister. And it was not sustainable for crossbench MPs to have more. What the Prime Minister was ignoring and didn't bother to tell the public was simply this, is that assistant ministers have an army of public servants from their departments, not to mention having the resources of the party machine to draw upon. Crossbenchers do not have that. We have 2 advisors who have to be across all the legislation coming through. That's our job, and I take that very seriously. Respect is a word that appears on almost every page of the Setting the Standards report. But what was very clear to every crossbencher in the Senate and the House is that the Prime Minister has very little respect for the job that we do, let alone our staff. And this was after the Prime Minister promised to treat the crossbench with respect. We usually get the legislation for each week's sitting in the last few days before the next sitting. Maybe they think that if the crossbench gets the legislation late, then they won't bother going through it. They will just wave it through. That's something I will never do. That means my advisors have to work the weekend before the sitting, and they usually work the weekend in the middle of the sitting. That's 17 days straight by the time we have finished. So we get all the bills a few days before they hit the Senate. This can mean my team having to get across a lot of bills. And then there are the amendments, which again can be many, especially in a week like this when we're doing IR. We have to dissect the amendments, go back out and engage with the stakeholders, not to mention preparing speeches that accurately respond to the legislation in question. And of course, then there are estimates and the parliamentary business of the Senate, holding the government to account for the Australian people. And then there are the committees that we participate in. Really important, especially if you are new to and want to learn a lot more. That means going to as many hearings as you possibly can to get good at your job, and reading all the submissions and again engaging with the stakeholders. I couldn't do any of that without the hard work of my team. It's my job to be across all this, and I work long hours and I'm paid well to do that job for the Australian people. To be clear, I'm not complaining. I love my job, just like I did in uniform, and I find it an absolute privilege. My concern is for the health and welfare of my staff. When Parliament is sitting, my staff regularly work 12 or 14-hour days, sometimes even longer. My electoral staff are also impacted by the sittings. If something happens or a bill is contentious, my office gets flooded with calls, and sometimes they can be extremely abusive, which means the electoral office has to take more of those calls, as well as the usual electoral and constituent calls. This doesn't include the hundreds of calls my office gets from veterans. Recommendation 4 in the Setting of the Standards report is about individual leadership, and I quote, "to strengthen individual leadership to ensure a safe and respectful work environment," end quote. How can I ensure a safe environment when I don't have enough staff? How can I ensure a safe environment when my staff is often sleep deprived? Doctors will tell you that not having enough sleep impacts your health and well-being. If this government really wants to set the standard, then giving the crossbench staff we need is critical, not just for ourselves, but for their own well-being. Is showing the crossbench and our staff respect really absolutely that hard? Seriously.